This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. This is Dustin Chandry, and this is episode 50. Yes, the 50th episode of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. So thank you to our early adopters who have been with us through our first 50 episodes. But for today's episode, we will be looking at players that you should not be afraid to start in Week 15. Of course, this is designed to help with some start-sit decisions and players that you should be targeting in your starting lineup here in Week 15. But before we get started, I want to remind you, you can follow and interact with the show. We are on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. Again, we are now verified. We are at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email the show at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now, I typically structure this episode going position by position, looking at some players outside the top 20 at running back and wide receiver and top 10 at tight end and quarterback. However, for today's episode, I want to talk about one specific team that we should be targeting across the board, across all position groups here in Week 15, and that is going to be the Los Angeles Rams. Now, the Rams have been the best offense in all of fantasy football for the last 3 weeks. They have the most combined fantasy points from the quarterback, running back, wide receiver, and tight end position groups from weeks 12 through 14. Now, on top of that, here in Week 15, the Rams are hosting the Washington Commanders. That game has an over-under of 50.5. That is tied for the highest of the week. And the Rams are favored by 6.5, giving them the second highest implied total of the week at 28.5 total points. Now, of course, you're going to start Cooper Kupp and you're going to start Kyren Williams. Both of those players are inside the top 20 at their respective positions. But let's talk about a few other players that you should be starting. First, we'll start with quarterback Matthew Stafford. Now, according to ESPN, he is listed as quarterback 10, but he ranges from quarterback 8 through quarterback 12 via ESPN's various contributors in their overall ranking. Now, Matthew Stafford has finished between quarterback 5 and quarterback 8 in weekly scoring for 3 straight weeks now. He has 10 total passing touchdowns over that 3-game sample, with touchdowns of 4, 3, and 3 over those 3 weeks. And over the last 3 weeks, Stafford has a 10-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio. He is 6th in the league in completion and passing yards, and his expected points added per play is 7th best in the league. Now, for the matchup, Washington has given up the second most points to opposing quarterbacks this season. And since week 2, opposing QBs are averaging over 23 points per game against Washington. You should be starting Matthew Stafford here in Week 15. And at the wide receiver position, of course, you are starting Cooper Kupp, but you should also be starting Puka Nacua, who is ranked wide receiver 21 on the Week 15 rankings. Now, Nacua has still not finished a game this season with a target share below 20%. He had another 9 targets last week, and in 13 games played this year, Nacua has finished inside the weekly top 20 in all but 4 of them, including 3 of his last 4. On top of that, he hasn't been below 30% of the team's air yards since before their Week 10 bye week. And even since Cooper Kupp has returned, Puka still ranks top 15 in the league in target share and target per route run rate at 26%, and he is top 15 in total routes run. So it's high volume and high performance. Puka continues to be undervalued every week, and I believe he is again this week. Now, just like we saw with Matthew Stafford, Washington is another great matchup for the wide receiver unit as it ranks 31st, so second to last, against opposing wide receivers this season. And then if you need a deep flyer at the tight end position, I think Tyler Higbee at tight end 23 is a good flyer to take just based on the matchup and the fact that the Rams are just crushing it right now from a fantasy standpoint. Now, Higbee did miss last week's game due to a neck injury. However, he was a full participant in Thursday's practice. He could return this week in Week 15. Last week, backup Davis Allen, he finished as tight end 6 on the week. He had 5 targets and a touchdown in place of Tyler Higbee. However, prior to his injury, Higbee had an almost near lock on routes run from the tight end group for the Rams. Higbee also has 3 top 10 weekly finishes on the season. So, to recap, make sure you are locking in as many Rams players as you can. This offense is healthy, it is clicking, and it is in a plus matchup against the Washington Commanders in Week 15. So let's move on and target some running backs outside the top 20 in the Week 15 rankings. And first, we're going to start with Lions running back David Montgomery, who is ranked running back 23 according to ESPN. Now, since his Week 10 return, Montgomery has kept a 54% rush share over teammate Jahmyr Gibbs, and his opportunity share when including targets is almost a 50-50 split. Montgomery has scored a touchdown in 4 of his last 5, and he has finished with double-digit fantasy points in every game since his Week 10 return. He has also finished as a top 20 running back in weekly scoring in 4 of those 5 weeks, and he's finished as running back 26 in the other. Now, the good news with David Montgomery is that he just doesn't bomb, right? He doesn't have bad fantasy outings. His only one bad fantasy outing this year is the game he left early due to injury. Now, on top of that, the Denver Broncos, they rank 31st. They are last in opposing points to the running back position. The next option right behind David Montgomery is Javonte Williams, who's running back 24 in the Week 15 rankings. Now, since Week 8, Javonte Williams has had a 75% rush share and an opportunity share of 65%. And since Week 8, he's only played over 66% of snaps in 1 of those 6 outings. Now, similar to David Montgomery, Williams has a pretty insulated floor. He has scored double-digit fantasy points in 6 of his last 7, with 3 top 12 finishes on the week. On top of that, the Broncos have very consistently had more rushing attempts than targets on a week-to-week basis. Since their Week 9 bye, 4 of those 5 games, the Broncos have seen more rushing attempts than targets by an average delta of 7 rushes over targets in that 4-game sample. And while Javonte does not run a lot of routes, those that he does, he sees a very strong target per route run rate. He has 37% target per route run, which is 3rd best in the league for players with at least 100 snaps played. So I had Montgomery at running back 23, Williams at 24, and right behind them, Raheem Mostert at running back 25. I think all should be starts this week in Week 15. Now, Mostert has finished better than running back 25, which is where he's currently ranked, for 6 straight games, with 3 of them inside the top 13 in weekly scoring. He has finished with double-digit points in 6 straight, with an average of 15.3 per game. Mostert has scored 7 total touchdowns over the last 6, scoring a touchdown in all but 1 of those contests. It's also possible that Devon Achane misses Week 15 with a toe injury, and keep in mind, Mostert had a 70% rush share and 61% opportunity share from Weeks 6 through 12 when Achane was out. As for the matchup, the New York Jets, they rank 25th against opposing running backs. And then the last option, this is going to be a bit of a deeper recommendation, but Antonio Gibson of the Commanders is currently running back 39. Now, this is conditional based on the health of Brian Robinson Jr. Now, Robinson, he left Week 13 with a hamstring injury. The Commanders, they were on a bye last week. But as of this recording, Robinson has not really practiced. He was not in Wednesday's report. And if he is out, then Gibson, I think, is a smash start in PPR formats. Since 2021, when Gibson gets at least 5 targets in a game, he averages over 15 fantasy points per game. And in a few instances where he got over 7 targets, he averages over 20 PPR points per game. Keep in mind, the Commanders lead the league in passing attempts since Week 10, with almost a quarter of their total targets having gone to the running back position. And as I mentioned earlier against the Rams, they are almost a touchdown underdog, indicating another game with high pass volume. So outside of Puka Nacua, I have 3 other additional recommendations at the wide receiver position that are outside the top 20. First, we'll start with rookie Zay Flowers of the Baltimore Ravens. He is wide receiver 26 this week. Now, Flowers has an almost 30% target share and 20% of the air yardage share in games this year without Mark Andrews. And when Zay Flowers gets at least 5 targets in a game, which he has seen in 10 out of 13 games this year, he has averaged 14.5 PPR points. As for the matchup, the Jacksonville Jaguars, they ranked 25th against opposing wide receivers on the season. Another wide receiver recommendation this week is Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns. He is wide receiver 28 on the Week 15 rankings. Now, excluding Week 13 when Cooper left with a concussion, Cooper has averaged a quarter of the team's targets per game and 45% of the team's air yardage. And in his first full game with Joe Flacco at quarterback last week, Amari Cooper had a season high 14 targets. Now, he only caught half of them for 77 yards, 12.7 fantasy points. But his target share and his target per route run rate, both of which were at 33%, were near his best marks for a game this season with Joe Flacco at quarterback. So Cooper's utilization was very strong, and with a better success rate, I think he is in store for a strong fantasy outing. And for the matchup, the Chicago Bears, they rank 16th against opposing wide receivers this year. And if you need a deeper recommendation at the wide receiver unit and you want to gamble, I think Zay Jones of the Jacksonville Jaguars is a very interesting option. He is ranked wide receiver 34. Now, last week, the Jaguars, they had 3 different players receive at least 11 targets in that game. Now, of course, they were in a negative game script, but Zay Jones led the team with 14 targets. However, he only caught 5 of them. Now, Zay Jones' 7.9 fantasy points is by far the lowest number of fantasy points in a game where a receiver had at least 14 targets. The previous low was 11.7, but the average for wide receivers this year who have seen at least 14 targets in a game was nearly 28 fantasy points. Now, Zay Jones has seen a lot of target volume when Christian Kirk has been either out of the lineup or kind of non-existent like he was in week 1. I think Zay Jones will continue to see high target volume. I think the question will be, can he improve on his success rate? 2 additional options at the tight end position this week outside the top 10. First, we'll start with Baltimore Ravens' Isaiah Likely, who was ranked tight end 11 this week in week 15. Now, I mentioned before with Zay Flowers that the Jacksonville Jaguars were very generous in opposing points to wide receivers. Likewise, they rank 26th against opposing tight ends on the season. Now, since the Mark Andrews injury, Isaiah Likely has consistently played about 75 to 80% of snaps each of those 3 games. And the last 2 games, Likely is 3rd on the team in total targets. He has a target share of 19%. Now, before their week 13 bye in week 12, Likely had 6 targets. Then they had the bye week, and then coming out of the bye week last week, he had 7 targets, and he was boosted by a touchdown. He finished as tight end 3 on the week with 19.3 fantasy points. So Likely is trending up. He has great snap participation. He's 3rd on the team in targets, and he has a pretty good matchup with the Jacksonville Jaguars. The other option at the tight end position is going to be Dallas Goedert of the Philadelphia Eagles. He is ranked tight end 13. Now, with the exception of Goedert's disastrous week 1 where he had a goose egg, Goedert has averaged over 6 targets per game. Since week 2, in games played by Dallas Goedert, the tight end group is getting a target share of 20%. And of course, that's predominantly led by Dallas Goedert. Now, I do get the apprehension because Goedert only has 2 top 10 weekly finishes on the season. Both were actually inside the top 5, but those also mark the only 2 games where Goedert scored a touchdown. Now, in his first game back last week, he only had 4 targets, which was a 16% target per route run rate. But prior to his injury, he was seeing a target per route run rate of 22% in the 4 games before his injury hiatus. Now, as for the matchup, Seattle ranks 19th against opposing tight ends. And last week, George Kittle went for 16.5 against Seattle, and Jake Ferguson went for almost 20 the week before that. And then lastly, at the quarterback position, of course, we talked about Matthew Stafford at the start of the show. The other option is going to be Geno Smith, who is quarterback 11 here in the Week 15 rankings. Now, let's start with the matchup. First, Philadelphia has given up the most points to opposing quarterbacks this season, with 4 of their last 6 opposing quarterbacks going over 28 fantasy points. And since Week 8, opposing QBs are averaging over 27 points per game. Now, this Monday night game with Philly has an over-under of 47.5, which is tied for the 3rd highest of the week. And when Geno has at least 35 pass attempts in a game this season, he averages over 20 points per game. Now, you're going to need to monitor his status going into Saturday since the Seahawks play on Monday night, but I would bet at this point he's better than a 50-50 shot to suit up and start on Monday Night Football. So that'll wrap up episode 50 of the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Make sure to like and subscribe. We'll be back with additional episodes next week, as we'll do a full recap with key observations and trends from week 15. And then again, we'll make some recommendations on players you should not be afraid to start as we head into week 16. So for Dustin Chandry, signing off here at the Fantasy Alchemist podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.